Bienvenidos, les doy la bienvenida a quienes están en estos momentos integrándose a la sala. Hello, Lisa, that's a pleasure to have you here. Really, I was so anxious to have you here because you saw everything online, the distance, and it's so stressful right now. So thank you that you're here in this conference that is the main of the first day of the Congress. So I'm so happy to have you.
Me too.
Okay, thank you. So we are going to start your conference, and first I want to give your brief CV, and I'm gonna say it in Spanish if it's not a problem for you, so everybody can have more idea de what is your work. Ok, bueno, Lisa es psicóloga y feminista estadounidense, es profesora de Psicología del Desarrollo y Psicología de Salud en la Universidad de Utah. Su investigación se centra en el desarrollo de la orientación sexual, la identidad sexual y su vínculo. Los libros que han sido recientemente más importantes dentro de su trayectoria es la fluidez sexual, así como el Handbook of Sexuality and Psychology. Realmente para mí ha sido una aportación muy buena la que está haciendo en estos momentos con su presentación, y pues espero que les guste, que generemos una conversación al final, y pues daré paso a su presentación. Okay. Lisa, then you are going to talk about sexual fluidity, revolutionizing our understanding of human sexuality. And you're going to how to talk. We have like 1 hour and a half, and we are going to give the last minutes of your conference, so at the end, all the questions that you can answer and all the comments. And we are going to have an open mic if necessary. And so this space is for you. Thank you so much.
Great. So I'm very happy to be here. Let me just share my screen. All right. I am delighted to be with you, and I always enjoy presenting my work in international settings because I think that the United States has tended to dominate a lot of research on sexuality, and I hate that. I want more diverse perspectives on sexuality. And so a part of what I'm hoping to do is inspire some of you to take up these questions and publish more, because I think we need more diverse international voices in the study of sexuality. And I hope to talk more about what aspects of some of the research that I'm presenting are unique to the United States and what parts vary across different cultures. I think that that's one of the most important questions that we can ask. So I'm going to sort of begin by giving you an outline of where we're going in this talk. I want to review current thoughts about sexual orientation and where it comes from and what it is. I'll provide a little context on why these are significant scientific questions, right? Why it matters. And I'm going to spend some time talking about a brand new study that came out in 2019 that was very groundbreaking, and it got some attention in the media, but most of the media attention didn't focus on what I think was the most important finding in the study. And I think that reviewing that finding opens up a lot of questions about the future of our thinking about sexuality and sexual orientation. And that's why I think of it as revolutionary. I really believe that we are at a turning point in our understanding of sexuality, and it's an exciting time to be doing this kind of work. And we'll talk about the implications, both scientifically and also for health and well-being and social policy. So there have been debates about what sexual orientation is, what causes it, for decades and decades and decades, right? For example, we don't even really have a good definition of sexual orientation. You can think about it as a pattern of sexual attraction, a pattern of sexual behavior or the seeking of sexual behavior. Then there's actual physiological arousal to sexual stimuli. And then there's self-identification, right, of individuals identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, heterosexual. These are not all the same thing, right? And so when we try to understand what the phenotypic range of sexual orientation is, and by phenotypic, I mean the expression of a human trait in the population. If you want to understand what is the expression of sexual orientation in the population, you have to decide what you think it is. Do you want to look at behavior? Do you want to measure attraction? Do you care about identity? These are all different things. And that's made it difficult to come up with a solid definition of sexual orientation. Another issue that has been relatively controversial is the stability of sexual orientation. Most of us in the sort of modern, Western world, think about sexual orientation as a stable trait, something like personality or eye color. It's just the way that you are. Other individuals have argued that it's not a stable trait, that it varies over time, that you might have sexual contact with a same gender partner one time, and maybe that doesn't mean that you're always going to want to do that in the future, right? So is it stable or does it vary over time? And then there's the question of causation. Why is it that some people are gay and other people are not? Is it something you're born with? Is it something that occurs because of something in your development in the womb? Is it something about the culture? How do we get to be this way? And then finally, there's this question of, well, does it matter? Does it matter whether we know the cause of sexual orientation? Can't we just sort of appreciate the diversity of the human experience? I will address each of those questions in turn, but I want to start with this question of what does sexual orientation look like in the general population? So I'm going to show you some data that was collected in the United States from a very large sample of Americans. And it's a random representative sample. So it's pretty reliable data. And the findings of this particular study, which was focused on patterns of sexual attraction, these findings are very similar to findings that have been collected in other countries. They're very similar to equivalent findings in the United Kingdom, in France, in Germany. So there is a growing consensus now that we have a pretty good picture of what types of same-gender experience are more common than others. So let's take a look at that data. So this was from something called the National Survey of Family Growth. It was a study of about 30,000 adult men and women. And they asked people to describe their sexual attractions as completely other sex oriented, like completely heterosexual, mostly, but not exclusively heterosexual or other sex, bisexual to both sexes, mostly attracted to the same sex, or only attracted to the same sex. And the reason that, that breakdown is interesting is that historically, a lot of researchers studying sexual orientation have thought about it as a two-category thing, that you're either gay or you're straight. And all you need are two categories. But over the years, there's been more awareness that there's actually kind of a scale, like a continuum going from exclusively heterosexual to exclusively lesbian or gay, and that people can occupy a number of positions along that scale. Even after we first started realizing this, there was still a long-standing assumption that most individuals with same-sex attractions consider themselves to be exclusively gay, and that folks that had attractions to both sexes were relatively rare. And largely that was because we didn't do a very good job of collecting samples that revealed the true diversity of the phenomenon. That has really changed. And many studies are doing what this study did. They asked people, well, let's figure out exactly where you fall. And directly contrary to what most people expected, they found that the most common type of same-sex attraction is a pattern of attraction to both sexes and not exclusively the same sex. So on this graph, I'm just going to show you the statistics for individuals who said they had some degree of same-sex attractions. So complete heterosexuals are not on the graph. This is only folks who have some degree of same-sex attraction. And what you find is that the single largest category is folks who consider themselves to be mostly, but not exclusively, heterosexual in their attractions, mostly attracted to the other sex, but with some same-sex attractions. And then the green bars are the folks that have attractions to both sexes, and then the pink block is individuals who consider themselves mostly, but not exclusively, same-sex attracted. And the yellow bars are the individuals who consider themselves exclusively gay or lesbian. Again, historically, we thought that the yellow group was the biggest group, and it's not, right? We can see that it's not. The total proportion of women with same-sex attractions in this study was 14%. So 14% of American women reported some degree of same-sex attractions. And that was true for 7% of men. So same-sex attractions are actually more common in women than men. And that has shown up in every single country and culture that we've looked at. And that's a really interesting question as to why that is. You can sort of imagine that these numbers correspond to the Kinsey scale. Kinsey in the 40s and 50s was the one that first showed us that sexuality is not just a matter of gay and straight, that there are gradations in between. So he developed the Kinsey scale to represent those gradations. A Kinsey 0 is exclusively heterosexual, a Kinsey 6 is exclusively gay, and then you have gradations in between. So this pink bar is sort of like a Kinsey 1, mostly heterosexual. And then the yellow blocks are the exclusive gay and lesbian individuals. But what I find so fascinating is that if you look at the proportion of same-sex attracted women who are attracted only to women, they are a very small group. They are the least common type of same-sex attracted person. And that's also true for men, right? Only 20% of men say that they are 100% attracted only to men. So directly contrary to what we used to think, patterns of bisexual attraction, of having some degree of attraction to both sexes, is a far more common experience than exclusively gay attractions. And that's a really important discovery. The other thing that I think is so interesting is the size of the mostly heterosexual group, a group that until 10 years ago, we never used to even ask about. We rarely talked about that or tried to assess it. It's almost like it's a hidden population because many of these individuals identify as heterosexual. They're like, well, I'm basically straight, but not completely. And that pattern is the single most common pattern. And that is not widely known. And I think it really challenges our assumptions about the way sexuality operates. So now let's talk about stability. So we know what the phenotypic range is, and we see that it's pretty broad, and there's a lot of bisexual patterns of attraction. What about stability? What do we know about whether sexual orientation remains the same throughout your entire lifespan? Well, it used to be that we didn't have good answers to this question because we didn't follow people over time. The only way we used to assess stability is by asking people, do you think that your attractions have changed over time? And people are not very good at accurately reporting that, right? A better way to assess that is to track the same people over time and ask them about their pattern of attractions and see if it changes. And so a number of studies have done that, large, big samples, following people over the range of years, right? So that's what these words, these acronyms at the bottom stand for. This is the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health, waves 2 and waves 3, waves 3 and waves 4, ranging between young adulthood and middle adulthood. This is a New Zealand cohort study. GUTS is a Growing Up Today study. That's another large cohort study. And the National Survey of Midlife Development is a longitudinal study of changes in adulthood. So in all of these studies, they asked people, are you exclusively attracted to one gender or the other? Or are you attracted to both genders? And then they asked that same question over and over again. So anyone that reported same-sex attractions was classified as a sexual minority. That's a term that's often used as a shorthand term for the whole group of people who experience same-gender attractions, even if they don't identify as gay or lesbian. So of the individuals who reported bisexual or same-sex attractions at one point in time, you can calculate the percentage of those individuals who reported a different pattern at the later point in time. For example, switching from saying that you're bisexual to now you're exclusively same-sex attracted, or the reverse pattern, saying you're exclusively same-sex attracted at one point in time, and then 2 years later saying, I actually think my attractions are more bisexual. These sorts of transitions have been documented in the literature before, but mainly in adolescence. And most researchers have tended to assume that changes in patterns of attraction are most common very early in life, because you might still not know what your attractions are. However, all of the participants in these studies were adults, right? So they have lived long enough that you would expect that they would kind of understand what their pattern, what their orientation is. But what these studies found is that very many individuals report changes over time in their specific pattern of attraction, right? So these are the proportions of women and men who reported same gender attractions at one point, who reported some change in that pattern over time. And so you can see that across these different studies, these changes are common experiences, right? Occurring between 20% and almost 70% of each sample. So stability is less common than change. The other consistent pattern, which you can see, is that the red bars are always larger than the green bars. Women appear more likely to report changes over time in their attractions than men do. And the reasons for that are hotly debated. We don't completely know. So it's a very fascinating question as to why this is true. The other phenomenon that we have done a better job observing over the years is same-sex behavior, having sex with a same-sex partner among individuals who consider themselves heterosexual in other ways, who would say, I'm basically straight, but I had this one relationship and it was sort of interesting, but I don't think it means that I'm necessarily gay. I think in the early days of research on sexual orientation, if individuals said something like that to a researcher, our response tended to be, wow, you must be repressed, or you must be afraid of social stigma. You must be closeted. You're having trouble admitting to yourself that you're actually gay. now we realize that that isn't always the case. Certainly, stigma and fear of social disapproval is a big reason that someone with same-sex behavior might not identify as gay, because it's a stigmatized identity. However, that doesn't mean that every single heterosexual person who has a same-sex experience is lying about their orientation or is wrong. There simply is a lot of diversity in the expression of sexuality over time. And so individuals with a heterosexual sexual orientation may find themselves in a same-sex relationship, and they might even enjoy it, right? So there's nothing necessarily wrong or crazy about that. And in fact, it's relatively common. So in some of the large-scale studies that have been done, and again, these are just abbreviations for each of the study names, and these are pretty big samples again, you find that somewhere between 2% and 6% of men and women who identify as heterosexual say that they've had at least one same-sex experience. And there has been data collected in recent years showing that as society has become more accepting of same-sex sexuality, heterosexually identified individuals are more likely to engage in same-sex behavior. There are more opportunities to question your sexuality than have existed before. So this has also sort of revolutionized our thinking that, wow, same-sex sexuality is not just a feature of gay and lesbian individuals. It can also be a feature of a heterosexual lifespan. This is why I started thinking and writing and talking about the concept of sexual fluidity. And I define sexual fluidity as a capacity for variation in sexual desire and sexual responsiveness, right? So this was my way of trying to update our understanding of sexual orientation, that it wasn't exclusively gay versus exclusively straight, that it wasn't always perfectly rigid, and that individuals were capable of experiencing desires and behaviors that don't match their overall orientation, and that these are all valid and viable and important parts of human sexual diversity and expression. The other thing that I emphasize about sexual fluidity is that you can sort of think about it as a heightened sensitivity to different factors. Situational factors like access to information about same-sex sexuality, interpersonal factors like whether you meet someone that you happen to be attracted to that surprises you, and contextual factors. Are you living in an environment that is accepting of same-sex sexuality? Is it safe for you to express your desires? Some individuals appear to be more sensitive to those external factors than others, right? One individual might completely refuse to act on same-sex desires if they are in a stigmatizing cultures. Others will go ahead and do it. And if you want to understand why we have such variation in expression of sexual orientation, you have to understand that every individual has a different degree of sensitivity to the outside world and to opportunities. Another thing that I think is really important is that I'm not trying to suggest that we should get rid of the notion of sexual orientation, that it's wrong, that it's bad. I do think that sexual orientations exist. I simply think they are not as rigid as we used to think. And you can almost imagine that sexual orientation and sexual fluidity are two independent pieces of a person's sexual lifespan. Orientation tells you how strongly you're drawn to one gender or another, or both, or neither. Fluidity tells you How variable is that pattern? How much might it move around if you experience different environments and different people, right? So everyone has a pattern and everyone has a capacity for change. And it's the combination of those two things that you have to keep in mind when you're trying to understand diversity in the developmental trajectories of sexual orientation, right? Two people might both be oriented toward the same sex, but one of them might be a little bit more fluid in that pattern, and another one might be more stable in that pattern. This then raises this question of why, right? If fluidity is something that varies from person to person, why? Why are some people more fluid than others? And there's a related question of, wait a second, how can you tell the difference between, for example, a fluid heterosexual, someone who's oriented toward the other gender, but has some flexibility and so might have a few relationships with the same gender? How can you tell the difference between that person and someone whose orientation is actually bisexual, in which it's not that they're fluid, they just have always had attractions to both? The external view of those two individuals might be very much the same. You might look at them and say, wow, both of these individuals have had sexual relationships with men and women, but maybe for different reasons, right? One of them might be mainly interested in men and only a little bit interested in women. And, if the right opportunity comes up, that might end up being a relationship. Another person might be like, oh no, I've always been attracted to both men and women. That's just how I am, right? From the outside, these two things look the same. And so there's this difficulty in understanding just what is evidence for someone's underlying orientation, right? How can we know whether we're detecting something that's stable or fluid? Now, this goes back to the question that I raised earlier. Does it matter? Do we care whether someone is a fluid heterosexual or a bisexual, right? Is there any significance to answering that question? And I think there is. And I think that you can sort of see the relevance of this question in some of the political debates that have gone on around sexual orientation in the United States and in other countries. So there is this phrase that has been used in a lot of debates about sexual orientation. Gay people are born that way, and so therefore we shouldn't discriminate against them, right? So the born that way argument has been used as a justification for extending civil rights to individuals in same gender relationships. What's interesting is that technically it shouldn't matter, right? If you decide that in your culture, individuals should be able to pursue whatever relationships they want, then it doesn't matter why they want to do so, right? The difference between a fluid heterosexual and a bisexual doesn't really matter from the perspective of public policy. Either individuals have the right to pursue their intimate relationships the way they want, or they don't. However, what has been interesting is that over the years, the born that way argument, which is sometimes called immutability arguments, that argument has been used many times as a basis for extending legal protections to lesbian and gay and bisexual individuals. And as I wrote in this article with a colleague of mine, Cliff Roski, this has been a real kind of problem, because the idea that you only deserve rights if you were born with your orientation doesn't make a lot of sense. It was sort of a convenient argument many years ago, but now it has led to a lot of sloppy thinking about sexual orientation. And in this article, which was really fun to write. I collaborated with a legal scholar, and his part of the paper was saying, you know what, we don't even really need that argument legally. There's no necessary basis in US constitutional law to say because something is born in you, it deserves special status. And so this argument has kind of blinded us to some of the diversity in the development of sexuality. Now, the question of what is the difference between a mostly heterosexual and a bisexual is relevant from a scientific perspective, right? To someone like me, who's just deeply interested in what sexual orientation is, those distinctions do matter because we're trying to understand why people end up showing different patterns than others. The key thing is that the answers to those questions are scientific answers. They're not public policy answers. They're not legal answers. And sometimes in debates about sexuality, science is used to make a political argument. And that's not always good for either science or politics. The other reason that I think it's relevant to ask these questions about what are the differences between different types of individuals is that one of the things that we have really come to understand over the years is that individuals with same-sex attractions experience those attractions and experience their own life courses in so many different ways. It used to be that the only terms that we used about sexuality were lesbian and gay. And now we have so many other words. We have bisexuality, we have queer, we have heteroflexible, and that just shows that the real phenomenon is diverse. And individuals themselves, I think, are hungry for information on what about them is unique? How are they different from another person? And these questions relate directly to that. The final reason I think it matters is because it might help us understand one of the biggest threats to well-being among lesbian, gay, bisexual, and other individuals. And that is health disparities. In other words, differences in health status. On average, individuals who identify as lesbian or gay or bisexual tend to have poorer mental and physical health than other individuals, and we don't know why. So understanding just what it is that makes this population different from other individuals can help us answer that question. So to just give you a sense, of these disparities, this is, by the way, a paper that I just published with my graduate students on this topic last year. And what we did is we systematically reviewed all of the published data from the past decade that was documenting differences in the health status of lesbian or gay or bisexual individuals versus heterosexual individuals. And the differences are fairly large. I'm hearing a sound and I don't know what it means. Okay, I'll just keep going. So we've known for years that sexually diverse and gender diverse individuals have poor mental and physical health. The prevailing explanation is something called minority stress. In other words, the simple act of moving through life with a stigmatized status introduces stress every single day, dealing with discrimination, dealing with anti-gay harassment, dealing with worries about who knows that you're gay and who does not. These are all things that are taxing to your brain and to your body. We know that psychological stress can have very toxic effects on the body over the long term. And so individuals who go through life with a stigmatized status are exposed to more stress, and that stress takes a toll on the body, right? We see the cascading effects of social stigma on autonomic nervous system functioning, on hormonal functioning, neuroendocrine functioning, and immune system functioning. The problem in documenting these links is that some subsets of the lesbian and gay and bisexual population seem to have higher risks than others. And we don't completely know why, right? So that's another reason that we want to try to understand what is different about this type of gay person than that type of gay person. Might it have something to do with their health risk and their exposure to stress, right? So let me give an example of these differences in these subpopulations. This was a study that was published a number of years ago, reporting data from a large national survey that was conducted in the United States with over 93,000 individuals. So this is a pretty big sample. And they asked individuals whether they considered themselves heterosexual, bisexual, or lesbian and gay. And then they looked at their rates of different mental and physical health problems. And prior to this study coming out, most individuals assumed that the individuals who would have the poorest health were the folks who were exclusively gay or lesbian. And the reasoning behind that was that bisexual individuals might be able to avoid some of the stigma facing lesbian and gay individuals, because sometimes they would be involved with heterosexual partners. And so they might not get the same sort of stigma and bias and hatred directed toward them. So if that's true, you would expect that the bisexual individuals shouldn't look very different from the heterosexuals on measures of mental and physical well-being, whereas the lesbian and gay individuals should be the most different from heterosexuals. That was not what has been found at all. So just to show you the magnitude of these effects. So these are the heterosexual women in the sample, about 53,000 women. And these are the rates of mental distress, poor sleep, poor physical health over the past 14 days, and dissatisfaction with life. And so these are relatively, similar rates that you find in other countries. Then what do you find in the lesbians? The lesbians are a little bit higher in mental distress, sleep, and life dissatisfaction. And then there are the bisexuals. They have far higher rates than any of the other groups. And the asterisks indicate statistically significant differences. So the lesbians weren't even significantly different from the heterosexuals on these disparities. It was only the bisexuals, right? You see the same thing in men. Here are the heterosexual men in the same study. Here are the gay identified men. They don't look that different. And here are the bisexual men. Again, they appear to have more mental health risks than exclusively lesbian or gay individuals. And one of the things that I think is so important to remember is that, remember that graph that I showed you earlier. Individuals with bisexual patterns of attraction are pretty common, and they are also exposed to greater health risks. And so that's why we need to try to understand what makes bisexuality different from lesbian and gay sexuality. Why are they at risk? One possibility that has been suggested is that bisexual individuals have sort of a double dose of stigma, because mainstream heterosexual society disapproves of same-sex sexuality altogether. And then the lesbian and gay community can sometimes be hostile to bisexuals. There is a long history in the LGBT community of exclusively lesbian and gay individuals not trusting bisexual individuals, thinking that they're just closeted, or they're just experimenting, that there's something wrong with them because bisexuality doesn't exist, right? there were a lot of stereotypes about bisexuality that were just plain wrong in previous years. And so that stigma might be an extra added dose of minority stress and its effects on the body. That certainly seems like a reasonable explanation, but it doesn't appear to be the only explanation, because some longitudinal studies have found that bisexual teens start to look different from gay and lesbian teens and heterosexual teens, even before they start identifying as bisexual. So here's an example of that. This is longitudinal data that was collected from youths ranging between 11 years of age and 22, right? And you can see that prior even to puberty, the bisexual individuals had higher rates of depressive symptoms than the other groups. Many of the kids in this study ended up self-identifying as gay or bisexual around this period of time, between 16 and 19. And you see that around that time, the depression rates of lesbian and gay individuals pop up, right? So this effect appears to be due to a coming out effect. But why is it that you don't see that effect in bisexuals? They start higher and they stay higher the entire time, even though they haven't even identified as bisexual yet. So that tells us that there is something different about these groups, and it has relevance for mental and physical well-being. And so we need to kind of figure this out and understand it. So that raises this broader question of whether there is something fundamentally different at a trait level, at the trait dimension of sexual orientation, that makes bisexuals and fluid heterosexuals, mostly heterosexuals, different in a fundamental way from exclusively gay or lesbian individuals. And from heterosexuals, right? Maybe the big distinction is between individuals who only have sexual attractions for one gender and individuals who have attractions that are flexible enough that they can extend to both genders, right? Maybe monosexual versus bisexual is a more important distinction than gay versus straight. The other related question is, can these distinctions help us understand health disparities? Can they help explain why certain subgroups have more depressive symptoms than others, or more physical health problems than others? This is exactly why some of the new genetic findings on sexual orientation are so interesting, because we know that genes are a part of the equation of what makes individuals different from one another. And we know that genes are also directly relevant to a lot of mental and physical health problems and development. Depression runs in families. Anxiety runs in families, right? Health problems run in families. Now, none of the effects of genes are ever completely deterministic, right? Humans are complex, and our genes are always interacting with our environment. But we know that there are genetic influences on sexuality and on health. And so if we want to understand whether some groups of individuals are at greater risk of minority stress than others, we have to include a focus on genes in addition to focusing on other things. And that's why some of the new genetic data is so interesting. Now, up until this new study had been published, the previous work on the genetics of sexual orientation was done with twin studies, where they would get two identical twins. They would find out, which one was gay and which, whether they were both gay, one was gay, neither of them was gay. And then they would look at the concordance ratios in those groups, right? Because identical twins have 100% of their genes in common. right? So what they're looking for there is something called proband-wise concordance. In other words, if you are heterosexual, how often is it the case that your twin is heterosexual? And if you are not heterosexual, how often is it the case that your identical twin is also not heterosexual, right? So among all twin pairs in which at least one twin is not heterosexual, what percentage is that true for the other twin? And is it higher than you would expect by chance? Furthermore, the other question that's asked by a lot of these studies is whether you find more similarity in identical twins than fraternal twins, twins that share only half of their genes. So a lot of studies have found that in general, there's significant concordance, and the concordance is higher for identical twins than fraternal twins. So that's pretty reliable evidence that genes have something to do with sexual orientation. However, they obviously aren't deterministic, because if they were deterministic, if your genes completely determined whether you were gay or straight, then this 0.24 figure would be 0.99 or 1, right? So it's clear that something more than genes is going on. When you calculate heritability, the percentage of variation in a population that's due to genetics, you find that the population estimates for the heritability of sexual orientation are around 0.3. And the interpretation of that is simply that about 32% of the person-by-person variation in sexual orientation is attributable to genetic differences between individuals versus environmental differences, like how they're raised. One of the things that I think is interesting is that, 0.32 is statistically significant, but there are other traits that are actually far more heritable. Smoking, 60% of the population variability in smoking, at least in the United States, is due to genetic factors. So we don't normally think about being born a smoker, but the propensity to smoke, the desire to smoke, is related to genes, right? Genes for impulsiveness, genes that influence how responsive your body is to nicotine, right? So it just shows that there are lots of complex human behaviors that have a mix of genetic and environmental components. Sexual orientation is not the only one. Personality shows heritability rates ranging between 0.45 to 0.6, right? So again, a lot of complex human traits have a combination of genetic and environmental influences. Even job satisfaction. That's my favorite example. We don't necessarily imagine that when a baby is born, we don't say, oh, I wonder if he's going to turn out to be satisfied with his job, right? But that's also genetically related. Why? It has to do with agreeableness. It has to do with what types of interests you have, whether you're a critical person or not a critical person. Those are all things that are also genetically influenced. So the big revolutionary finding that I want to close with, which I think is such a wonderful jumping off point for discussion, is something called genome-wide association studies. These are studies where they're not just looking at twins, they're looking at the entire genome of a particular person, all of their genes, thousands of their genes, looking for any possible genetic variation between one person and another, right? And what they're looking for is something called a single nucleotide polymorphism. In other words, a genetic variation, right? A gene that can take two different forms, brown eyes versus blue eyes, tall versus short, right? So what they're looking for is, are there polymorphisms, these forms of variation that show up in gay or lesbian or bisexual individuals and that don't show up in heterosexuals, right? So there were a few preliminary studies that didn't really find anything. But part of that is because these studies are hard to do. Because you're looking at so many genes, you have to have a lot of people in your study to find anything meaningful. And the thing that was groundbreaking about this study that was published in Science magazine is it had the largest sample we have ever seen. So this is the title of the study. And what is really interesting is the size of this sample. I think most psychologists will never have a sample this large, 477,000 individuals in the United States and the United Kingdom. And the reason that we have their genomes is in the United Kingdom, they have something called the UK Biobank, where individuals donate their genetic material, fill out a bunch of questionnaires so that people can ask questions like this. The American sample came from the company 23andMe, which does genetic testing on a whole bunch of different traits. So it's a large sample, but it's not a perfect sample. It's only the United States and the United Kingdom. It's only the individuals who were involved in these two things. So there are limitations, right? The other important limitation is that the outcome that they looked at was simply whether someone ever engaged in same-sex behavior, even if it was just once, right? That's not really what we normally think of when we think of sexual orientation. We normally think that sexual orientation is about attractions. And we think, well, behavior, not everyone has the opportunity to act on their attractions, right? So behavior has so many environmental constraints, right? You might be living in an area where it would be really hard to meet a same-sex partner, right? So that's another big weakness, that was the outcome that they used. But it's a limitation of just the way this research is done. They also chose that because they wanted to get as many people in the study as possible. And there was a relatively small proportion of folks who ever had same-sex behavior. So they had to leave it really broad. They didn't want to say, did you have it more than once? Or did you have it in adulthood only? Or do you have it every year? They just said, did you ever have this behavior? And that amounted to around 4% of the sample, which is about 19,000 individuals. So what did they find among these 19,000 individuals? First of all, they did the same sort of study of heritability based on twins and based on family relatedness. And they found exactly the same thing that was found in the twin studies, which is good. It suggests that it's a reliable finding. Specifically, that about 30% of the person-by-person variation in sexuality was related to genes, was related to family resemblance. They also found that when they looked at each individual SNP, these polymorphisms, there was not one gene that was related to sexual orientation. There were hundreds. And each of them alone had a tiny effect. And that instead it appeared to be hundreds of them operating together that appeared to be distinguishing between folks with same-sex behavior and folks without that behavior, right? And all together, they estimated that all those SNPs together accounted for somewhere between 8% and 25% of an individual's likelihood of ever having same-gender behavior. The reason that range is so broad is because of the techniques that are used to estimate genetic variance in these types of studies. They did find that there were 5 SNPs that were specifically associated with having same-sex behavior, but interestingly, they were a little bit different between women and men. There were, and actually I have a slide for this, there were gender differences, right? So the red diamond indicates polymorphisms that were associated with same gender behavior in both men and women. So there are 2. The upside down triangles are the ones that were associated with same gender behavior only in men. And then this gray one is a SNP that was only significantly associated with same-sex behavior in women. So we know that there's this genetic influence, but there's this sticky, thorny question, right? Is that the right outcome? Is that really sexual orientation? And so the researchers did something a little different, which is where I think the exciting part of the findings are. They redid their analyses looking at people's reports of same gender attractions within the group of individuals who had any sort of same gender behavior, right? So they took that 19,000 individuals who had any same gender attractions, and they had data on those people on just how attracted to the same gender they were. Are they someone who is mostly same-sex attracted, bisexually attracted, or not very same-sex attracted? And one of the reasons that they looked at this is that it sort of makes intuitive sense that whatever the genes are that put you over into the category of, having same gender behavior, that it sort of makes sense to imagine that the more of those genes you have, the more same gender behavior you're going to engage in, right? So that this pool of individuals who had some same gender behavior, that whatever genes got them into that category also determine how far over on the Kinsey scale they are. Are they all the way over to a Kinsey 6, or are they more around a Kinsey 1? And this is the blockbuster finding of the study. The variation from Kinsey 1 to Kinsey 6 within that group of individuals who had same gender behavior was, in fact, also genetically influenced, but by a different set of genes altogether than the genes that predicted who was going to have any same gender behavior. In other words, having one same gender experience is not really interpretable as being less gay, right? It's a different phenomenon, and that you can't presume to know the underlying kind of biological basis of a person's orientation simply based on whether they ever acted on their attractions or not. And I know that this is kind of a complex idea to understand, and so I'm hoping that in the discussion we can pull out this. But one way that I like to think about it is that the trait of ever engaging in same gender behavior is sort of like the trait of being willing to take a risk in your life, right? If there's one thing that we can say for sure about the folks who only engaged in opposite sex behavior, is that, because we don't know whether they ever wanted to engage in same gender behavior, we just know that they didn't. And the state of not doing that could be related to a lot of things other than sexual orientation. They could be related to whether you're a risk taker, whether you have an agreeable personality, whether or not you're drawn to new experiences, right? Those are things that might operate in combination with sexual orientation to determine whether you end up in that ever have same-sex behavior category. But once you have enough of that trait to engage in same gender behavior, the amount of same gender behavior that you engage in is predicted by something different, by your orientation, right? And so if we want to understand, in the same way that we have to think about fluidity separately than sexual orientation, we might also have to think about this sort of openness to new experiences, willingness to take risks as another thing that works in concert with sexual orientation to shape our life chances. And here, and the final point that I'll make, and then I'll open it up to questions, is that this might have something to do with the health disparities that we see between bisexual individuals and both heterosexual and lesbian and gay individuals. Because it turns out that the genes that are associated with ever having same gender behavior are also associated with a lot of other personality traits that themselves are linked to health and well-being. Propensities to use marijuana, propensities to use other substances, lack of consistent use of protection against sexually transmitted diseases, right? So one potential explanation is that among individuals with bisexual orientations, given that they have attractions to both the opposite sex and the same sex, if they are really a risk-averse person, they probably will just live a heterosexual life. They might never express their bisexuality. And so the only bisexuals that are going to show up in our samples of bisexuals are those that have a bisexual orientation and also a predisposition for this openness, for this willingness to take risks, for this, risk tolerance, right? And so that's why those individuals might be overrepresented among individuals with depressive symptomology and other problems. So some of that comes from minority stress. Some of it might come from individual differences in our susceptibility to stress. And bisexual individuals might have a different susceptibility to stress in addition to a different sexual orientation. And I think that sort of the next stage of our research on sexual orientation will be understanding more about these other forms of variability among lesbian and gay and bisexual individuals that shape their health and well-being in combination with and parallel to their genetically influenced sexual orientation, right? And that basically the underlying construct of sexual orientation is not enough for us to understand the life experiences of people with different patterns of attraction. They are also substantially different in other genetic and environmental ways. And the next stage of this research will be to take these findings forward to try to understand what are the real differences between individuals who experience their sexuality as more fluid or more fixed. How does that relate to their childhood development, to their adult relationships? How does it relate to their health and their psychological well-being? So that is where this research is going. And with that, I will start taking some questions.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, everybody. Unfortunately, our time is up, so we have to finish this conference. Thank you so much for your time, really. And just I hope that we can meet again, as this is the third conference that I heard from you, and that was really amazing as well.
And I'm easy to find on email, so if you have other questions or you want to talk, just shoot me an email.
Yes. Muchas gracias por su asistencia. Hasta luego.